Now to the big story of the day, the G20 summit. The world's focus is on the Xi-Biden bilateral. But from India's perspective, this summit holds special significance. Because in a few weeks, India will be taking over the presidency of the G20 for a year. And that's why it is worth tracking Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi's engagements. What are the priorities for India? Let's find out. We begin with the basics. Why does India's presidency matter? Well, the G20 is a major global decision-making body. It has 20 of the most advanced economies. They represent 85% of the global GDP, 75% of the world's trade, and 66% of the world's population. That is the scale of this alliance. What is the purpose of the G20? Initially, the G20 gathered to discuss global economic and financial stability. In recent years, the agenda of the alliance has evolved. The annual summit of the G20 is now a forum to discuss some of the most pressing global problems and issues. Previous summits have dealt with issues like the 2008 financial crisis, Iran's nuclear program, and the civil war in Syria. The meetings on the sidelines have often led to international agreements. So as a collective, the G20 can pack a punch. But during the pandemic, the G20 let the world down. Its response to COVID-19 was described as sluggish and inadequate. The war in Ukraine has made it more difficult for the G20 to forge a consensus on important issues. The US is a member of the G20. So is Russia. The divisions within became more clear and apparent ahead of that summit. It is against this backdrop that India will be taking over the presidency of the G20. Even Prime Minister Modi recognizes the challenge.
India's G20 presidency is coming at a time of crisis and chaos in the world. The world is going through the after effects of disruptive, once-in-a-century pandemic, conflicts, and lot of economic uncertainty. Shared knowledge that helps us overcome our circumstances, and shared prosperity that reaches the last person at the last mile.
That sums it up, really. Bridging the global divide will be one of the priorities for India. So what else will India focus on? Prime Minister Modi's engagements at this year's summit give us some insight. Ahead of his departure for Bali, a statement was released. These are the words of the Indian Prime Minister himself. Prime Minister Modi lists out 5 key issues: reviving global growth, food and energy security, environment, health, and digital transformation. At the summit, Prime Minister Modi will be participating in 3 key sessions: food and energy security, digital transformation, and health. Safe to say, these subjects will feature prominently during India's presidency as well. The global community has expectations. The UN General Secretary Antonio Guterres recently visited India. He made an appeal.
And I count on India's support in mobilizing G20 countries around debt relief. Many developing countries are at or near debt distress and require multilateral action, including the expansion and the extension of the G20 debt service suspension initiative.
Debt relief. The UN chief believes India can help in mobilizing the G20 on this front. America has expectations from India as well. Last week, the US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen was in New Delhi. She drew attention to the challenges before the global economy.
In 3 weeks, India will assume the helm of the G20 at an uncertain time for the global economy. We look forward to supporting India's G20 presidency. A successful Indian presidency is indispensable to our global economic recovery and sustained progress on our deepest problems.
Russia will be watching India's presidency too. Back in September, Prime Minister Modi had met the Russian President Vladimir Putin. The meeting took place on the sidelines of the SCO summit. Ahead of the talks, a Russian news agency had put out this story. It revealed details about what Putin wanted to discuss with the Indian Prime Minister. One of the items on agenda was Russian-Indian cooperation within the UN and the G20. And recently, Putin had lauded India's growth story.
Let's look at India. Talented, very driven people with such a drive for internal development. India will certainly achieve outstanding results. India will achieve outstanding results in terms of its development. There are no doubts. In almost 1.5 billion people, now that's potential.
It is natural for world leaders to have expectations from India. As president, India gets to set the agenda for the G20. During the summit, Prime Minister Modi is expected to brief world leaders about India's priorities. Reports say he has 20 engagements planned, and we will be keeping a track of the latest coming in. WION now available in your country. Download the app now. Get all the news on the move.